library. They do research, obviously. So some of the books that I brought with me, the library has, and they're all interesting to read and good for research. You know, for those of you who don't want to read a lot, this little book, Sketches of Hudson, written in 1862, is very interesting about a lot of the topic that I talked about a couple of years ago and today's. This little book is, the original, as I say, was in 1862. It is available out there, though it was reprinted in 1985.
What is the name of it?
Sketches of Hudson. And the author is Stephen Miller.
You got a reading list?
I don't have a reading list. I'm going to do it right now. All right, so the next is Hudson's Merchants and Wailers. So this was written by Margaret Schramm about 25 years ago. Well researched. She did put a lot of time in it. She went to New Bedford and Fall River. She did research in Coxsackie. It's well footnoted. This is a very good piece of research if you're really interested in, you know, all of these topics and whaling. Okay. And when you read this book, the first thing you'll note is that, you know, she debunks the idea that Hudson was really a whaling port. And it's true that, you know, Hudson was small compared to the other whaling ports. It's not true that it wasn't a consistent whaling port for, you know, several decades. So kind of her theme is a little unfair because no, Hudson wasn't a huge whaling port, but Hudson was a thriving whaling port.
Did they make whaling ships here?
Well, they made many whaling ships here. Contrary to popular opinion, though, there are no whales in the Hudson River. Okay, so these copies are copies of the original proprietor's minutes. So I have a copy, and the city of Hudson has a copy. I've never seen another copy. Both Hudson's and mine are copies, not the originals. The originals were filed with the city clerk's office in 1811. I don't know what happened to them. So these you could pass around if people want to. They're just photocopies.
What are they?
They are copies of the original proprietor's minutes. So in it, there are minutes of meetings, all kinds of things about conveyances of property and creation of tanneries, blacksmith shops, and, you know, all of those kinds of things that we're going to talk about. Also, there are laid out maps of the streets in the city. So for those of you who didn't know, Hudson was one of the first planned cities in the United States. Excuse me. Savannah, Georgia was earlier than Hudson. That's about it. And when you look at this, the layout here is like New York City. It's, you know, it's a uniform layout of streets. The difference, interestingly, between New York and Hudson, other than size, is that we have alleys. New York doesn't have alleys. And think about what a great place New York would be if they had alleys. So this little volume is called An Abstractive Title. Don't worry, folks, I didn't start yet. I'm just kind of introducing the documents that I have up here that you can look at. And they're, You know, you can touch everything. Some of them are old, but it's okay. So this document, this is a document that lawyers would read all the time. It's what title searchers put together. It's called an abstract of title. The interesting thing about this one is it was used in a piece of litigation by William J. O'Connor, who was a lawyer in Hudson at the turn of the 18th to the 19th century, 19th to the 20th century. And so this abstract searches the title to all of the property on Front Street and on Water Street. So down in the oldest part of the city. And it goes back to 1662. And in 1662, Jan Frans van Hoosen purchased Hudson, Greenport, and Stockport from the Mohican Indians.
How much?
Doesn't say. And that sale was approved by the provincial governor of the Netherlands. That was 2 years before the Netherlands no longer was in control, as the English took over in 1664. So some of these put out some. I was involved in some litigation a number of years ago involving the Fergery Boat Club. And when we did that litigation, we got copies of maps that were in the state of New York's possession, the Office of General Services in Albany. And these are land grant maps. So these are things that you can find if you're really interested in researching these kinds of things. These maps are out there, and they tell you who the state of New York gave land grants to and when. And most of them, they're commerce grants, most of them were done sometime between 1830 and about 1880. And they're all laid out on these maps. So there's a couple of others here as well. So some of these things, for those of you who don't really know who I am, I'm Giff Whitbeck. I'm a lawyer in Hudson. I was born here in 1948. My family has lived in Hudson since about 1820. My family has lived in Columbia County since 1667. The first Whitbeck came in. He was who lived here in 1822, went to medical school in Pittsfield, and then came to Hudson. He was born in Red Hook in 1802. His son was born in 1838. He was a lawyer, a judge, fought in the Civil War. Very interesting man. I gave most of his artifacts to the Columbia County Historical Society. These things were very interesting. Letters from the Civil War and newspapers and all kinds of things that he collected. His son was born in 1878, was a lawyer, a judge, lived until the early 1950s. Interesting thing about the Dutch, and Columbia County was all Dutch in the western part of the county, from say Hillsdale west. And the Dutch, lived here in the 17th century. My grandfather, who died in 1952, still spoke Dutch when he died. And my father didn't speak any at all. My father was born in 1912, but his father spoke Dutch in the house, not Of course, he spoke English when he was out in his business world, but spoke Dutch in his house. And his wife and his cousin's wife were Huisrits, so they were Dutch too. They were born in Ankrum. Anyway, my purpose in telling you that is just to give you some idea of my background and why I pay attention to this stuff. So, this book was owned by one of those two lawyers that I just identified for you. And this is an abstract of virtually the entire waterfront of Hudson that goes back again to 1662, but then also outlines all of the parcels as you go along, all the way from the South Bay to the North Bay. So it's difficult reading to get through, but if you wanted to research the history of Hudson from the beginning, this is it. So this book, The History of Columbia County, was written in 1876. And it was written, these books were written in virtually every county in the United States in 1876 for the wasn't the bicentennial, centennial. So every county has one of these. How accurate it is, it's not footnoted, it's, you can't totally rely on everything that they say in here, but it is very informative and is for all of Columbia County, not just for Hudson. This book has a tremendous quantity of information. The library has one. This is a copy. I had a couple of the originals. The library has an original. So there are a lot of these around, so you can research with those. Okay, what else? So Herman Melville is part of why we're doing this, so I was told. So this book, which I think the library does have, is a very good group series of articles from critics about different great American novels, including Moby Dick. The interesting thing about this one is that it is tremendously informative about whaling and whaling ships and all of the stuff that goes with whaling and harpoons and boats and how you find the whales and all those kinds of things. Extremely interesting article, not a long article, 30 or 40 pages, but very, very interesting. So, some of you may not know that Herman Melville lived in Troy. He was born in Pittsfield, lived in Albany, went to Albany Academy. It just doesn't make any sense to me that he never came to Hudson. For sure, he did, because he knew there was whaling here. Well, it was his lifelong interest. It wasn't something that he just stumbled upon. And he lived in Troy in the 1830s. So the second stage of whaling in Hudson was a flower in the 1830s. Excuse me, in the 1830s. And the biggest ships that sailed in Hudson sailed in the 1830s. And the biggest pot of gold that came back was a ship full of spermaceti whale oil. $80,000. Think about how much money that was in 1833 when that boat came back. And all those guys, they basically split up the money. They had a captain, they had an owner of the boat, and all the guys who were out there for 2 years split the money. That was how they did it. Oh, so this book, Columbia Rising. I'm not sure how many of you are into politics, but this is a great political treatise on, a small county and in the early 1900s. Martin Van Buren, Alexander Hamilton, Aaron Burr, they're all in here. The Bee, the Hudson Gazette, the stuff that went on between Hudson and the rest of the county, which has never stopped. I know I'm Dutch, and I'm from Hudson. The Dutch and the Hudsonians never got along. They were just from different worlds, completely. Once the Quakers came here and started their sailing businesses, people came from all over the world to work here. And they were not the same as the people who were here. The Quakers never got used to that. All of a sudden, they had, Catholics, and people from the South and the Caribbean, and all of these different nationalities who came here to work. And they never got used to it. The last of the Nantucketers died in 1839. Many of them left Hudson before that. They went to New York. So this book is a great book. These two books, so for people who are really interested in what buildings were used for in Hudson, these are Sanborn Maps. So one is 1895, I think the other one's 1915. You'll see there's a Whitbeck on there. He was a surveyor. I didn't know him. But anyway, these books show every building in Hudson on those dates and what they were used for. So extremely interesting for research purposes. So on the wall is a map of Hudson in 1881. That's an original, or a copy of the original. The library does have an original. And it's similar to the Sanborn Maps, but when you look at it, you'll see you can find every structure in Hudson. And just find where you live, you'll find it on there. And then if you go to the Sanborn map, you'll find out what that house was used for in 1895. So it's quite interesting. This is a copy of it that you can pass around if people want. This is a photograph of Evans Ale, which was a company in the North Bay. They started to make ale in Hudson in 1835. It was one of the biggest industries here. Prohibition put them out of business in 1919. They had about 40 employees. All right, so these things are interesting to look at. This is a print from Athens looking at Hudson in 1825. So you'll see when you look here, there's the South Bay. Around the South Bay there are industrial buildings. Almost all of them are tanneries. And I'll talk to you in a minute about tanneries. These buildings up here are warehouses and shipbuilding, sail making, things that go along with the sailing business. Athens had similar buildings in Athens. Athens had shipbuilding just like Hudson did. The shipping itself was in Hudson. This is Promenade Hill. Promenade Hill was one of the original parade grounds in the United States. It was dedicated by the proprietors in about 1790 for that purpose. So it's always been a park. And interesting in the, in those proprietors' minutes, you'll see other places where they created parks and public spaces. They didn't get paid for any of them. They were all wealthy men when they came here. So it wasn't that they needed to be paid. It was, they were very successful businessmen long before they came to Hudson. What else can I show you? There's a steamboat schedule in 1843. Shows all of the ports on the Hudson River between Troy and New York City. This is a map of Columbia County in 1829. The interesting thing about it is you look at it, and Stockport and Greenport are still part of Hudson. Well, that didn't change until 1835. This is a print of Hudson looking toward the river from Rossman Avenue, or from the top of Warren Street. And again, you can see all kinds of houses and structures, the courthouse, the Presbyterian church. I mean, it's very interesting to look at and to see. Hudson especially in the 1840s, maybe even a little earlier, was a place where lots of artists and map makers and people who were just interested in business and businesses and industry came to create their work. So there was an artist named William Bartlett who was did prints of literally hundreds of cities in the United States. Hudson was one of the first ones that he did, 1831, I think. I didn't bring that one. I'm sure you've seen it. So this is a print of Mount Marino looking across south from Promenade Hill. The painting was done by a French artist in 1815. So this is what the waterfront looked like then. Okay, you'll see that there's a ferry slip that was actually dug out, and that went from Hudson to Athens. If you go down to Promenade Hill now and you look, you'll see that ferry slip is still there. You can see it. It's cut out. It's all overgrown, but it's there. And this one is a watercolor of the South Bay. It was done in 1921. And you can see how the bay has silted in over the years, because when you look at that one over there, the South Bay is wide open. It's like a big lake. There's nothing in it. There's no growth, no underbrush, no anything. It was just part of the river. But once they built the railroad, then it started to silt in. The interesting thing about this watercolor is that in the background, if you really look carefully, you can see the Hudson Iron Works, which was built in 1852, just after the railroad came through. So Hudson changed completely in a 3-year period. I'll just show you. This is a painting by Sanford Gifford. It was done in 1849, looking at Mount Marino. I used to live in that house. This is one of the first paintings that he did. And he was, I'll tell you more about him. So this one basically the same painting. This was painted by Ernest Parton 20 years later. So when the Gifford was painted, the railroad wasn't there, the ironworks wasn't there, it was pristine. When this was painted in 1869, both the railroad and the Hudson Iron Works were there. They existed. He just chose not to paint them. Okay, so that's the stuff I brought. Oh no, I got one more thing. And if you, this is the original proprietor's minutes that I spoke of. So you'll see. See that original proprietor's minutes. Some of it's a little frail, but this was a copy that was done in 1822, and one of my great-grandfather, was able to buy it. We've had it ever since.
Wow.
Okay, so.
So can we introduce you?
Sure.
This is Carl Whitbeck. I just wanted to welcome you and also welcome Mr. Whitbeck to this talk. It's the history of Hudson merchants and whalers, and it is a collaboration with Hudson Hall, and it's part of their Hudson's Merchants and Whalers programming that they've been doing this fall. So I just wanted to say a couple of things. Hudsonians are very proud of their history, and we could tell by the audience that's here tonight and all of the people that wanted to get in the room. And they're also very proud and supportive of their cultural institutions, and the fact that there's a thriving library and a thriving arts and cultural hall in one small city really shows the proof of that. So since this is the library's 60th year that we've been in existence, I'm going to quote from William E. Klein, who was part of a group who worked to get the library for Hudson. You know, we were the last town to have a library in New York State, but that's okay. So this is from the Hudson Daily Star of 1949, and now I wish I had brought the original, which we have. The quote, "The kind of citizens we are determines the kind of city we have and determines our future. Let us all finally be pointed out as a good city, as a progressive and cultured city." And it took them 10 years, but then they did have a library. So, and mentioning that, this program is free, but there's a donation box in the lobby, and I just wanted you to know that all proceeds from tonight are split between Hudson Hall and the library. And we also have flyers and programs from Hudson Hall that you can look at. I'd like to introduce Tammy Dillon, who's the executive director of Hudson Hall, and will say a few words.
I think we're more interested in hearing what Carl has
We
to
will.
say, so I'm going to be really brief and just say that it's a pleasure to welcome you. It's an even bigger pleasure to work with the Hudson Area Library, and that when we started thinking about what we could do to celebrate Melville's 200th anniversary, and my own selfishly personal desire to read Moby Dick and find a reason and a context to somehow present a series that reflected Hudson's origins as a whaling town, and Moby Dick and the anniversary and a great literary masterpiece, we knew we had to work with the library. And I'd like to just thank Carl and his daughter Caitlin, who have been big champions of both Hudson Hall and the library. And without further ado, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, and I have one more thing to say, sorry. So yesterday, I found out, because we always say when Mr. Whitbeck comes to talk that he's a local resident who has deep roots in the area, and he showed me his great-great-great-grandfather, who was in the original Hudson City, the first directory of 1851, and the entry is Whitbeck, Volkert, physician, 313 and a half Warren. And he wasn't the first one.
So naturally, I have something to say about the library too, now that we brought it up. So the library was founded in 1959. So the organization that Brenda was talking about was active, reviled, treated horribly. You know, I was 10 years old, 11 years old. I can remember going to events where people would talk about wanting to have a library, and other people didn't want to pay for it, didn't want the city to pay for it, didn't want people from Greenport being able to come there, didn't want people from Stockport being able to come there. My father was the president of the school board. So the school acquired the orphanage when the orphanage closed, so there was a library. Amazing. And it happened. Unfortunately, the school district never took care of the library. The building itself witnessed this building, which was necessary. A much better building for the library. And interestingly enough, with what Brenda said, there were at least 15 libraries in Hudson before 1850. Obviously, none of them made it, because we didn't have any in the 20th century. So, this topic was given to me by Brenda to look at, and some of the things that I found in doing this were surprising to me. I was not aware when I first took on this assignment how active Clarvik Landing was as a port before the proprietors came here. And it was very active. It was not a whaling port, but shipping came through Clarvik Landing right down into the South Bay early on, in the early 18th century. Farmers from out in the county, out to Litchfield County, Berkshire County in Massachusetts, would bring their produce, their livestock. There were butchers in the area of Clarvik Landing, and they would ship their goods to New York City. They did it winter and summer. They had, snow carts with runners on them that they would bring them into Hudson with them. Well, Hudson wasn't here. They didn't bring it into Hudson. They brought it to Clarvik Landing, which was just a couple of docks and a couple of warehouses down in the South Bay, but extremely prosperous. So prosperous that this group of men living in Nantucket who were sick of the French and the British destroying their fleets, stealing their sailors, wrecking their business lives and their family lives, and they decided, think about the timing of this, 1783, what happened in that year? The Peace of Paris happened in that year. As soon as that treaty was signed between the United States and Britain, they came here. They already knew that Clarvik Landing was here, was already prosperous. So they thought, we'll have a great start to our business, and we'll bring our whaling here, and we'll have West Point to protect us, which is one of the reasons why they wanted to come up the Hudson River, because the French and the British navies did not pass West Point, so they'd be free, and they were, and it worked. So when they came here, again, these are very wealthy men. They had, after they bought Hudson, basically in 1783, they went back to Nantucket and they created Hudson. They brought 30 or 40 prefab houses to Hudson and built them here, right in the South Bay, right down on Water Street. They built warehouses. They brought a whole fleet of ships, whaling ships, Hudson River sloops, all kinds of sailing vessels. Sails, the ability to make sails, which didn't exist to a degree. They brought all of the technique, the technical aspects of what they were doing with them. So when they got here in 1784, they were immediately in business. And they knew how to run their business. Yes, sir?
Were they just predominantly from Nantucket or almost exclusively?
No, I misstate myself to say that. Several of them were from Providence, Rhode Island. Okay, but most of them were from Nantucket, and the ones with the most money were from Nantucket. But they definitely had, there were about 40 of them, I think. And 30 of them were from Nantucket, 10 from Providence. So there was a political issue going on in Nantucket at the time, because Nantucket was a very successful sailing place before the Revolution. And they weren't necessarily that much in favor of the Revolution, because they could figure out the threat to them if they supported the Revolution. So there was a significant group of Nantucket sailors who didn't come this way and went the other way. They actually left Nantucket and went to Nova Scotia. A couple of years ago, we went to Nova Scotia, my wife and I, and saw the places where they settled up there. And they did the same thing. It's just amazing to just pick up and take everything and create a whole new life, which is what they did.
What towns is
It was outside of Halifax, and then there were also Lunenburg. Right? Lunenburg is the other town where
I sailed on the roads.
lots of loyalists went to Lunenburg, and there were, all over New England, loyalists went to Lunenburg and to Halifax. But the Nantucketers weren't, they were involved in politics, but they were businessmen. They were going for business reasons, not so much for the politics of it. And they were also, they were Quakers. So they didn't feel all that comfortable, not necessarily with all of the other people around. They seem to have fit in quite well up in Nova Scotia. Here, not so much, because Hudson, they lost track of Hudson very quickly. Hudson grew, changed, was a completely different place from what they thought it would be once they got going. By 1805, Hudson was off on its own. They didn't control the Common Council anymore. They still had their business enterprises, but Hudson was full of bars and all kinds of crazy things that were no interest to them. There were lots of Irish immigrants that they couldn't accommodate themselves to. Reading that book that I talked to, Columbia Rising, gives you a lot of the flavor of the differences and how out of it they felt in their own city. I mean, they created the city, but it wasn't their city soon after. So as I said, Hudson, the Clarvick Landing was a great attraction for the Nantucketers, much more than I had ever realized. I mean, I knew of the proprietors and I knew of the Revolution and all of that, why they wanted to come, but I didn't realize that they also knew that this was an economically viable place to come, that they would be able to immediately make money, and they did. So some of the things that immediately they created were tanneries. And tanneries are, you know, for making leather out of pelts. And they were very successful with it. There are several tanneries on Tanner's Lane. If you drive up Tanner's Lane, you'll actually see the foundation of one of the biggest tanneries. They had 60 plus vats that they soaked the skins in, making leather. And the leather, a lot of the leather came from New York, some of it from Albany, and from butcher shops and those kinds of things. It was shipped in here. They would turn it into leather and send it back. So tanning requires hemlock. Also, the hemlock is in the Catskill Mountains, across the river from Hudson. So from 1790, about when the tanneries started in Hudson, and the tanneries in Athens were active, and in Cairo, and in Wyndham, and in Prattsville. Some of you don't know where those places are, I know, but they're west as you go over the Catskill Mountains. So from 1790 to about 1900, every single tree in the Catskill Mountains that I just described to you was cut down. It was completely denuded of trees. So all the trees you see in the Catskills now are all 20th century growth. Nothing existed after the 19th century. They either burned them or they used them in tanneries. And tanneries were prevalent all over this part of New York. Gloversville. What do you think they made in Gloversville? Gloversville is right at the base of the Adirondack Mountains. Same thing happened there. Just miles and miles and miles of trees torn down. Fultonville. You know, that whole area. Later than here, you know, more in the early 20th century. But same thing. So what else did they make here? They made sails. And they made sailcloth. They did most of their shipping, especially early on, to the Caribbean and to the South. So the biggest ports that they would go to would be in Jamaica or in South Carolina, Charleston. They did lots of trade. There were big, rum-making enterprises in Hudson very early on. Like 1795 or so, they were producing rum to a great extent. And they would take lumber to Jamaica and come back with sugar and rum. You know, they made rum. And that was a big business. They did that, you know. Some of the Quakers, Thomas Jenkins, for example, was the richest of the Nantucket proprietors. He made rum. He didn't drink it, but he made it. Lots of it. One of the interesting things is that because they had so much experience with shipping, Robert Fulton had most of the parts for his original steamboat made in Hudson. Partly because Hudson had iron foundries. So iron foundries started here in the early 19th century. And they were smaller at that time. And part of the reason why they were smaller at that time was because they didn't have a source of iron ore. The best place where they would get it would be in Ankrum and in Copiague. And getting it here was difficult. Eventually, they built a railroad through the South Bay to Ankrum and Copiague so that they could bring iron ore here. And then in the early 1850s, two guys, one's named Jacob W. Oisrip. Remember him? One of my great-grandfathers. And Elihu Gifford, Sanford Gifford's father, decided to build the Hudson Iron Works. So they built this huge factory, 10 times the size of any other foundry in Hudson. Built it down on the South Bay, right along the railroad track. As soon as the railroad was there, well, then they had a way to get iron ore here. They also bought a quarry in Lee, Mass. You still see it on the Mass Pike. It sits over there on the right-hand side. Well, they owned that quarry, and they took all the iron ore out of it and brought it to Hudson and used it to make what? Well, they started off making stoves. That was the thing that was the biggest part of their process. But then what happened? Well, the Civil War happened. What did they make then?
Cannonballs.
They made every cannon that you can imagine in the Union arsenal was made in the Hudson Iron Works. Every cannonball that the Union Army shot, lots of them were made in the Hudson Iron Works. And in Troy. And the Burden Iron Foundry in Troy was just bigger than the one in Hudson. It actually bought the Hudson Iron Works in 1871. Just a huge business. So I'm getting ahead of myself. I got to go back to the beginning. What were we doing in 1790? So blacksmiths everywhere, because everything that they were making was made out of iron. Or they were dealing with horses, or they were doing fixtures on their ships that were all made out of iron. And blacksmiths made all of that stuff. There were just dozens and dozens of them right off the bat. Caulkers. What do caulkers do? They caulk the boats so they don't sink. Well, they had 30 boats in 1784. You know, they had to caulk them all the time. They had big ships, they had little ones, sloops, you know, rowboats, everything, and they had caulkers. They made hardtack. I could never quite figure out how they make that, but it's made with beef, and it's kind of a a permanent treatment that allows them to store the hardtack on board ships, so they have something to eat when they're out. Yes, sir.
I was studying the Civil War, hardtack's always just a biscuit, not meat.
Well, maybe it is a biscuit, but maybe it is. Maybe I'm using the wrong term, but there was the biscuit too, and they made the biscuits for the sailors, but they also had a beef product, maybe like jerky or something like that they made. Yeah, you're right. Thank you for correcting me. So what were they doing with the whale oil? What was the big deal about whale oil?
Lamps.
Candles, lamps, oil. Whale oil was better than tallow oil, for example, for candles, because it burned cleaner and burned with more light. So it was a very popular thing. And, whale oil was popular for about, 50 to 60 years in the United States until coal gasification. We had a coal gasification plant in Hudson. It was built in about 1853. It's the little building on Water Street on the other side of the railroad station. You look over there. Some people call it the lumber yard or something else. I've forgotten what else people call it. But it was a coal gasification plant. And they made gas out of coal primarily for streetlights. Put the whaling business out of business. When I first started practicing law here in the 1980s, one of the first things that we did, I represented the city, one of the first things that we did was force Niagara Mohawk, which later owned that coal gasification plant, to clean it up. Underground, there were thousands of gallons of creosote buried behind that building in the ground. It had leached into the Hudson River. It was a mess. They spent several $1 million cleaning that up. At that same time, there were petroleum tanks and a big tank farm in that area. I've forgotten who owned it, Mobil. They didn't want it anymore. So they let it go for taxes eventually. The city was able to acquire it and tear those tanks down. That was in the early, mid-1980s. So when I was a kid, on First Street, right almost over to Columbia Street, there was a whale oil factory, right there. It was right on the corner. It's just not a big building, but they made candles in that building. And it was still there when I was a kid. So what else did they make in Hudson? They made stoneware. So I was going to bring some of them, but it was raining, and I'm sorry I didn't bring them. You've seen them. They're bigger pieces of gray, salt-glazed stoneware. It was made all over Hudson. And, they were made for, people's houses. They would store liquids in them, stuff. All 5 of the ones that I have pharmacy advertising on them. So the pharmacies were all from, before 1850. They didn't have drugs in those days like we do. They had patent medicines. And patent medicines were like, cod liver oil and stuff. So you'd buy a whole container of cod liver oil, take it home in your stoneware and your advertising. And when I was a kid, Wardle's was the oldest pharmacy in Hudson. It was founded in 1800. It was on the corner of Front and Warren. It was still in business for, into the late 60s, early 70s, before those guys, they just got old and got tired of being pharmacists and didn't sell their business. They just packed it in. But there were other pharmacies downtown too. There was a pharmacy on the corner of 3rd and Warren. And there were others uptown. And as I got older, they moved uptown, which is interesting, I thought. So by the time I was in college, there were 2 pharmacies on the 6th to 7th Street block that weren't there in the 50s. History info. So let's tell you a little bit about what happened to Hudson in those beginning years. So these guys were very successful. They were very politically astute. Although they didn't get along with the Dutch well at all, they were able to, get things that they wanted. They got Hudson, was the third incorporated city in the United States in 1785. So they got that through the legislature, even though all of the assemblymen, all of the senators were Dutch and lived out in the county. None of them lived in Hudson. They still were able to get that done. Why was that? Because Hudson had grown from 0 to 3,500 people in less than 5 years. So they produced, and people knew it. And they were encouraged to continue to produce, and they did. So they were successful until, 1805 about. And in 1805, those pesky British and French were messing around with shipping again, creating all kinds of problems. The pirates in Algeria were attacking shipping that came into the Mediterranean Sea. And so President Jefferson decided to, embargo a lot of the United States to protect, our shipping. More the ships than the shipping. So it virtually put Hudson out of business. Hudson became a port of entry in 1790. Port of entry is a port where goods from afar can come in to the United States and be shipped out. So Hudson was a port of entry from 1790 to 1815. So for those research folks out there, the county clerk's office has census records from 1790 to at least 1840. And you just can't imagine the information that you can find in those books. They just tell you everything about business here at that time. Population and all of that as well. So you can see, when you look in those census records, you'll just see that business just went in 1805. And that continued until 1815, and the port of entry, the United States just closed it. There was no business here anymore. The original bank that was created or founded in Hudson failed in 1819. Another failed in 1825. Hudson was in a very difficult time. The whaling business was totally done. In 1805, 1806, they were out of the whaling business. They were still shipping to New York, but there wasn't as much money in that. That was the way they were able to sustain all of the infrastructure that they had. Whaling is where they really made their money. The rest of it was being able to cover their expenses. So in 1829, several of, again, the original Nantucketers were still here. And they started to build whaling ships again because whaling was coming back. The British and the French were done. Napoleon was exiled. And, all of that warfare was over. The British stopped impressing American seamen, and off they went. So they built, several whaling ships, 6 or 8 whaling ships. They had, 15, 20 voyages. A voyage would take, 2 years. So they'd leave Hudson, they'd sail south to the, off Argentina. There were big whaling grounds in that area, and then they'd go around the Cape and come out in the Pacific Ocean and sail around there for quite a long time, looking more for sperm whales than other whales, because sperm whales have spermaceti, which is a finer type of oil that could be used and was worth more money. So they would travel afar looking for spermaceti. Yes, sir.
Was that just a part of that whale, a certain part that had that special oil, not in all
The
of it?
spermaceti was not in the whole whale, it was in its head. Yeah. And, you know, they knew all about whales, so they knew how to get the oil out and how to extract it and how to, anyway, get them up on the ships. And, you know, the whales were as big as the ships. So the sperm whales are 60, 70 feet long. Anyway, so as I said, their most successful voyage then, I think, came back in 1833 with $80,000 worth of whale oil on board. About, 20 men were on the ship. And there were several. They were successful through the 1830s. Beginning in the 1840s, things started to get harder. They were still doing their other shipping. They were building ships. They were doing sails and all the rest of the stuff. They started making rope. They made rope for sails, for their sailboats, but they also made rope as a manufacturing product. And Thomas Jenkins, again, owned the biggest factory that made rope. And they had a rope factory on State Street that ran from 2nd Street to Front Street. And they built a rope trail that was 600 feet long. If you go over there, you'll see that on that side of State Street, it just kind of falls off. So they had this kind of rope walkway that they built and just used for 30 years or so. And they made, rope in Hudson, and they made money at it.
You must have twisted it on the long streets, right?
I don't know how, they had a long, they did have a long warehouse. So, it was very long and narrow, and they I don't know how they made the rope. You?
No,
No,
I was
okay.
curious what they made the rope from.
They made it from hemp, and they imported it. So when they go to the Caribbean, they come back with whatever the product is that you make rope with. They'd come back with it, and then they'd make the rope. And then they'd use it themselves, and they'd sell it in New York. Most everything that they did was for sale in New York.
What part did the Erie Canal in 1824 play?
That's such a great question. The best question. Just think about it.
Repeat the question.
The question was, what happened in 1825 that affected Hudson? The Erie Canal opened. When the Erie Canal opened, that meant that every product in the United States could be shipped to the city of New York without stopping in Hudson. And that's exactly what happened. So not only was the whaling business bad, but all of the businesses were affected by the Erie Canal. They never recovered from that. The Erie Canal made New York City the greatest city in the world. The Erie Canal did that, not the people of the city of New York. But the people who built the Erie Canal were the people who really made something. Because that was the greatest thing in the world. For 50 years after it was built, it was just a huge moneymaker. Totally opened the West. Totally made the United States.
Elijah Williams, who had a house here, advocated for the Erie Canal. Did he not understand what would happen to Hudson?
I don't think anybody had a clue. Governor Clinton certainly didn't have a clue how successful it would be. For him it was, a political enterprise. Oh yeah, this is a great idea, let's do it. Let's go out and build the Erie Canal. All of a sudden, you know, they've got more merchandise than the whole world can take over. Yes, sir.
The long building that the road was made in,
Yeah.
is there an image of that somewhere? Because
Not
I'm
that I-
interested
not
in
that
this
I know of.
location vis-à-vis Rope Valley. but-
Well, it definitely was over by Rope Valley.
Yeah.
I don't think it was quite as far over as Rope Valley. But they did have a, good question. They did have a smaller, you know, like rope warehouse on Rope Valley, where the name came from, going from 2nd Street east.
Do you know anything about Jervis, if you want to talk about him?
Who?
Jervis, the guy who built the railroad that destroyed Hudson's Bridge, who started as a laborer in the Erie Canal and designed some of it, and then built the canal.
I know there's a lot about the fundraising and all of that for that railroad. I really don't know that much about it. There was a railroad that was successful, the Hudson and Boston Railroad, that was built in 1854. You know, it was built from the South Bay. It's still there. It's basically the same rail line that, you know, that goes up to ADM and, you know, goes out through Chatham and goes to Boston. It's the same railroad. That's the only one I know of, other than one that went through the South Bay, but that only lasted a few years. As soon as they started to bring iron from Lee, that railroad went to fall. It was only a few years. Yes, sir.
How did the Erie Canal connect to New York City? It helped make the city. What was the connection? Just through
The
the
Erie Canal comes from Lake Erie
Yeah.
in Buffalo, comes across basically the Mohawk River, straight across New York to Cohoes. And there are locks built in the canal to get around, you know, the bumpy parts of the Mohawk River. And, you know, there are huge falls in Cohoes that have locks that, you know, that they're able to get around and right down into the Hudson River. So just south of Troy is where the Erie Canal met up with the Hudson River. And then straight to New York. Straight to New York.
Without stopping here.
Without stopping in Hudson. No reason to stop in Hudson any longer.
Was there ever any slave trade in Hudson?
You know, it's a good question. There were slaves in Hudson in the 18th century. So the Dutch, many Dutch families owned slaves. I've never seen any evidence that there was a slave trade in Hudson. So there wasn't an auction, there wasn't a place to, you know, that they traded slaves. And in New York, slavery was abolished in 1808. So you could only keep a slave after 1808 if you owned a slave before 1808. And slavery was abolished completely in New York, I think it was 1820. So if you had slaves, you had to divest your slaves. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
They gave, that's what I heard. I went to a lecture and there were 19,000 slaves in Columbia County. 19,000.
Yeah.
And we gave them $45 and told them they're free.
That would be a lot. I've heard a man who lives in Newburgh, who's a professor at New Paltz, I believe, lecture about slavery in the Hudson Valley. And there certainly was slavery in the Hudson Valley in the 18th century. But I don't think that it was ever
Not that much.
not that much. But it was all farming, for sure. There wasn't any industrial business that was operated with slaves that I know of.
You know why your ancestors kept the Dutch language for so long? And I
Well,
say that
they,
in the
you know,
context
they were,
that they kind of.
you know, like a lot of folks, they spoke Dutch at home. Like lots of immigrants, they kept their language, and they taught their kids to speak Dutch. As I say, my father was born in 1912. He was the first one who didn't speak Dutch. And his parents spoke Dutch in the household.
The only reason I say that is Sylvie, who is the docent of the Van Bronk House. Fascinating, knows everything.
Yeah.
Whether what she says is accurate or not, I don't know. She, in response to my question about when the Dutch language died out, said it was the early 1800s.
Okay.
When it
So,
stopped being used.
I would say that the research and the reading and everything would agree with that, except that I had a father. My father told me that his father spoke Dutch in the household to his mother, together. And, you know, these were educated people. You know, they went to law school, they went to medical school. You know, my grandfather's cousin was a surgeon. Went to, you know, Harvard or Yale, I don't know which, but, you know, a very educated man, spoke Dutch. Spoke Dutch into the 1940s. Yes, sir.
There's one church in Hillsdale that Dutch and German was spoken until the 1950s, according to some
I'm not
residents.
surprised. There's a Dutch Reformed church in Athens, where I'm told, I don't know for a fact, but they spoke Dutch into the 1950s in that church.
Even in Woodstock, there was such a mixture of Dutch and German and English.
Well,
Other
true.
people come there and couldn't even understand what they were saying. None of them, because they had their own language.
Right.
Still kind of do today as well.
Well, just in my own family, if you think about, you don't really think about the Dutch being very oppressed, and I never felt oppressed, but my family stopped being Van Whitbeck in 1710. Why? They got sick of the English beating them up all the time, so they stopped being Dutch. They stopped using their name. All right, so I'll call on you in just a sec. I just want people, you know, if you're pressed for time, I tend to talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. So if you're tired, you gotta leave. Don't be embarrassed to get up and leave, because I'll just keep, as long as there's people sitting I'll keep talking.
That's a Dutch street.
Actually, I don't think so. Okay, so, yes, sir.
There's a picture, a photograph that must have been made in the 1840s of the South Bay, and the bay is just full of sailing ships.
Right.
And at that late date.
Small ships, though. They were sloops. They were Hudson River sloops.
Some of them were slow sail.
Well, they were still whaling, so there could be some. But the South Bay was not deep. It was not a. I know you'll hear people say that it was a deep water port, but it wasn't that deep. You know, 10 feet or so.
Surprising.
Right. I was
Pretty
surprised.
amazing photograph.
I was surprised at that too. But you're right. There were ships all over the South Bay and the river, all in the river. But on the east side of that ferry slip, you look at these things. You'll see them. There they are, right there, right in that print in 1815. How many big ships are there? So there's 4 big ships right in there. You know, they were. There's no question there was big shipping in here in Hudson all the way into the 1840s. When it stopped, it was done. That was the end of it. Whaling had two tunnels. The Erie Canal killed the rest of it.
Excuse me.
Yes?
In those early years, were there industries in which women participated, or cottage industries?
It's a good question. So there were lots of dress mills, dress manufacturing facilities, woolen factories, pocketbook factories, and mostly women were the employees in those factories. Those factories lasted into the 1950s. So on the corner of Washington and 6th Street, there's a big factory building. That was a pocketbook factory. So they would take the leather from the tannery, bring it to the pocketbook factory, and turn it into pocketbooks and ship them to New York. There was a dress factory on the corner of Allen Street and 2nd Street, where they would get orders from, big New York City department stores, make the dresses, send them back to New York. There were several of those in Hudson, way back into the 1830s. There were Mount Merino. Well, there's a reason why Mount Merino is Mount Merino. Oliver Wiswall imported merino sheep and raised them on Mount Merino, and they sheared them. They sold the wool in Great Britain for sure, but they also made their own wool and they made their own dresses, and they sold them in New York. He started that in 1815.
I should have to share that there's an image of that factory that I have that I purchased as a benefit from the Hudson Historical Society that must be in this building, showing 50 or 60 of such women in that pocketbook factory.
Right, no question.
All exquisitely coiffed.
Right. Look at the size of that building. And they were working on every floor in that building. And when you think about people working in factories in those days, I remember when I was a kid seeing women who were damaged, whose hands were cut, scarred, useless, couldn't use their arms. So those factories were dangerous, no question about it. Didn't stop people from doing them. And they worked there because they needed to work, but they were dangerous. So I didn't say another thing about the Nantucketers, which I did not know either. But a group of the Nantucketers, at the same time that our folks left for Hudson and the others left for Halifax, left for Greenwich, New York. If you can imagine that. I have no idea why they went there, but there was a significant group of them. And several of them were named Starbuck, which is a significant Nantucket name. And Sanford Gifford's mother was a Starbuck. So they came from Saratoga, which makes me think Elihu Gifford married Mrs. Starbuck, who was from Greenwich, who was from Nantucket, and that's why they came to Hudson. I always wondered why he came to Hudson, because he was successful in Saratoga. It's not the way he was when he got here. I mean, he made a fortune when he was here in the iron business. But anyway, so I'll just talk quickly about the artists, because Hudson was an aesthetic center too. So there were 6 very very successful artists who painted in Hudson in the 1840s and the 1850s. Henry Erie, Sanford Gifford, the three Parton brothers, and John Bunyan Bristol. John Bunyan Bristol was born in Hillsdale, but he came into Hudson to be a student of Henry Erie. Henry Erie was born in Providence, came to Hudson, was a friend of Thomas Cole's, lived in Catskill for the first 5 years that he was in New York, and then he came to Hudson about 1840. He lived here until he died in 1859. He was an art teacher at the Hudson Academy, which was a very successful school in Hudson. He was very successful at it. Those 6 artists produced over 3,000 landscape paintings in their careers. Hudson River painters and Barbizon painters. So the first painting I showed you, the Sanford Gifford, is a Hudson River school painting. The other painting, Ernest Barton, had already decided that the Hudson River School of Art was on its way out and decided to become a Barbizon painter. He'd been to France, came back, never painted a Hudson River School painting again, always painted Barbizon paintings. Relocated to Great Britain about 1880, lived there for the rest of his life. But Hudson was one of the, there were lots of places along the Hudson River and elsewhere in the eastern United States where art was not just something that people did. It was business, and they were really successful at it. Frederick Church sold The Heart of the Andes for $10,000 in 1859. Corcoran Gallery bought Niagara Falls from Frederick Church in 1865 for the same amount. He was an extremely successful man. He was wealthy anyway, but he was in business. He was a tremendous artist. He traveled all over the world to paint. He loved science. We went to Cotopaxi in Ecuador. He did some of the, you just can't believe that a guy like that, and he's 50 years old, he's climbing a 23,000 foot volcano in Ecuador to paint Cotopaxi. Think about that.
He lives in a shack here, though.
Well, I don't know what he lived in before 1865, but of course, he didn't build a shack. Wouldn't be my choice to live there. But anyway. So Sanford Gifford was, not quite as successful as Thomas Cole, but he sold almost all of his paintings during his lifetime. He owned paintings at the time of his death. He died suddenly in 1880, so he didn't prepare for it. He was very meticulous at keeping his records, but he sold at least 600 paintings during his lifetime. He was a very successful man as well. The Parton brothers, again, not quite as successful, but they lived, both Ernest and Arthur, lived all of their lives off of their art. Very successful men. And John Bunyan Bristol. John Bunyan Bristol's paintings were more in the Champlain Valley, in the Adirondacks, and interestingly in St. Augustine, Florida. His most expensive paintings that have sold for 100,000 or so were painted in Florida. All right, so then part of my interest in doing this was to talk about Hudson in the 1950s, which is a time frame that most of you don't know anything about Hudson. As I said, I was born in 1948. I grew up in Hudson. Hudson was an extremely successful town at that time, right after the war. All the men came back from the war. There was all kinds of enterprise here. Two very large cement plants that were built in the early 20th century. Hundreds of men worked in those cement plants. The V&O Press made presses and sold them all over the world. 100 to 150 men worked there. The population of Hudson in 1950 was 12,500. Population now is about 4,000. So it's quite a difference. The 1950 population was the peak. In 1850, the population was about 5,000. Interestingly enough, that was after Greenport and Stockport were cut off. They still had 5,000 people. 1850, that was quite a bit. It was bigger than the others. Kingston and Poughkeepsie was bigger than the other cities at that time. So, what were some of the things that were out there then? So, in the 1950s, we had, 3 stores: the Scoville shop, Macy's, and Marsh's. Marsh's was a big 5-story, department store. It's right next to where Stair Gallery is now. Macy's was across the street from Rogerson's. The Macy's family that started that store was the same Macy's family that owned Macy's in New York. They left here and they created Macy's. And somebody kept Macy's alive here. They had the name Macy's, just think about it. They had the name Macy's until, I was almost an adult. Macy's was still in business in Hudson. It wasn't owned by the department store either.
Nantucket who started Macy's?
Yeah, R.H. Macy, yeah. Very successful guy. Obviously made a fortune. Yeah. And he went to New York in 1845. Lord of Lord and Taylor was from Hudson.
Wait, what? No, I heard it. I
Lord of Lord and Taylor was from Hudson. And you look in the cemetery. The cemetery is just a wealth of knowledge for you if you're interested in it. You'll find their graves if you look. They're there. What else did we have here? Well, lots of bakeries, of course. Bakeries were very successful. The town fair. Town fair was located just below 6th Street on Warren Street on the south side. They sold toys. They ran the best business. The Coic family. It was just the best. Whatever you wanted, you could get there. Just the greatest memories. So Rogerson's. Rogerson's has been a hardware store at its present location since 1832. Rogerson's, unfortunately, in the early 70s when the Walmarts of the world came, well, there's no competing with them. You got to figure out something else to do. You can't compete with them. They're not going to go away. Unfortunately, not all the businesses in Hudson figured that out. And the Rolls Studio was a photography business. The original photographer's name was Frank Forshew. He was one of the earliest photographers in the United States. He built the building that his business was in on Warren Street between 4th and 5th Street. He built a skylight inside. Very successful man. He took most of the photographs that you see in those big groups of photographs of Hudson were taken by Frank Forshew. So my great uncle Volker Whitbeck bought the business from him. And he owned it for about 20 years after he got back from the Civil War. And then he sold it to a man named Sam Rolls, who ran it from about 1890 to about 1965. Very successful guy. Had a tremendous archive, which Craig Thorne bought from him. Craig Thorne owned an insurance agency. And so the archive is around someplace. I don't know where it is now, but it's around. As I said, we had so McKinstry's, Rossman, Wardles, were all pharmacies, gas stations. So there was a gas station in Hudson on the corner of 3rd and Allen Street. And across the street was Ritter's grocery store. So maybe not quite when I was a kid, probably into the 60s maybe. Stewart's built their store out by the Rip Van Winkle Bridge. That was the end of that gas station and Ritter's store. Stewart's store out of town really hurt them. When I was a kid, there was a Stewart's store just below 4th Street, next to the Hudson Register Star. And then when they built their store on the corner of Fairview Avenue and Green Street, they closed that store. So on the Fairview Avenue and Green Street was a gas station before Stewart's was there. It was a flying aid station.
Ritter's lasted into the 90s because.
Well, they did.
Yeah. Just for the record.
Right, no, it's true, but they're, you know, I knew them very well too, and you know, they regularly would tell me how much Stewart's hurt them. So, you know, instead of people pulling up, you know, you had to pull up to the curb and you had a 15-minute parking sign there. So instead of doing the 15 minutes, people would just shoot on through to Stewart's, and you know, that hurt them. So anyway. Banks, there was a bank at 219 Warren Street. And then there were the Farmers National Bank, the Hudson River Bank and Trust Company, Hudson City Savings Institution. So they were all on Warren Street further uptown. And now the only bank in Hudson is the Bank of Greene County. Car dealers. There was a car dealer on Columbia Street, just below Varick Street. So Varick Street is the street that goes into the back of the St. Charles Hotel when you're off Columbia Street. So just below that, there was a 3-story building, and there's all glass. It's probably still there. It probably looks just the same. And they sold DeSoto's. And they had DeSoto's in the window on the 2nd floor. They had an elevator. I don't know how they got them up there, but you'd see them. You know, I'm the kid. And a brand new DeSoto. I can't wait to go see it. There it is, right up there. So there was a Chevy dealer on Green Street, and there was an Olds and Cadillac dealership on Green Street. The place just next to the bank, as you're going east on Green Street, was a Coca-Cola bottling plant in the 1950s. They were in business until the early 60s, and then they moved out to the industrial tract, and they didn't bottle anymore there.
Do you remember Parker's?
Oh, yeah, Parker's, yeah. They made their own soda.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We had Wardell's bookstore.
Yeah, Wardle's I talked about on the corner of Front and Warren Street.
Canopy Brothers.
Who?
Canopy.
Oh yeah, Canopies, that's right. Canopies was sold Plymouths and Dodges on the corner of Glenwood Boulevard and Fairview Avenue. Yeah, I forgot about that, thank you. So I went around the city the other day and I counted up at least 24 places in Hudson in the 50s that were bars that had liquor licenses, at least 24. Many others that I know were after-hours bars, but didn't have licenses. Probably another 10. And I'm sure that many of you have heard that Hudson had a red light district that was quite well known.
I have questions, but I can't find out the information. What, the Tainted Lady Lounge?
So the Tainted Lady Lounge was just a bar
When was
that
that
was next to the Howard Hotel
When was that built?
in the 50s. Yeah. So it was owned by the people who owned the Howard Hotel at that time. They didn't last, it didn't stay in business all that long. Because the hotel went out of business shortly after that. Across the street from that hotel was the General Worth, which was a beautiful 19th century Greek revival hotel. Absolutely beautiful building. It was torn down in the 1960s. Made a political revolution.
Yeah, I restored the General Worth House.
Yeah.
You know, the General Worth House on Union and 3rd.
Well, that's a house, yeah.
Yeah. Had 8 fireplaces in it.
Yeah. No, that was a beautiful house. But that was fixed up. That wasn't torn down. So I'll just say that one of the things about Hudson that made it attractive, and the reason why people wanted to come here, I think, was because other than the first efforts at urban renewal way downtown, Hudson learned their lesson quickly and realized that tearing down the old structures because they were a problem wasn't the way to go. And so all of that urban renewal money was either spent on water and sewer lines or fixing up all the structures that were on Warren Street. And I'm going to challenge you to think about this. Go stand in the park on 7th Street and look straight down Warren Street to the river. I'm going to tell you the answer, so it's a little cheating. When you stand there, look for what you don't see. There are no power lines. Why not? Because we made Niagara Mohawk backlot in the 1980s. There was no power lines. Go stand in Beacon. Beacon has the same main street that Hudson has. Look down the main street of Beacon. They have power lines all the way down. Makes a tremendous difference. So out in the hallway, Brenda and I yesterday were looking at these, I don't know, are they photographs?
They're postcards.
They're postcards, okay. So look at them when you go out, because a couple of them, on most of them, they've airbrushed out all of the power lines, but they were all there. You'll see that there are trolley lines in the street. Well, those trolleys had electric lines over top of them. That's what they ran on. But in a couple of those airbrushed postcards, you'll see the power lines going down the side of the street, and what a scar they were. They just totally destroyed that. Stand at the orphanage and look at the courthouse. There's, in the backlotting, we had to let them have one place where they could cross. So that was it. I've questioned my input into that ever since. Because when you stand there and look at the courthouse, it's ruined, because that's all you see is power lines. Yes, sir.
Can you say a few words about the churches here, the big beautiful churches here in Hudson?
So, it's, my topic is supposed to be businesses, so that's why I didn't talk about churches, but I can, for sure. Population, there was a significant population in Hudson, and there was a significant church population in Hudson. So the Nantucketers were Quakers. So the Quaker Meeting House in the end is on Union Street between 3rd and 4th Street. A very small meeting house. There were several Quaker meeting houses all in that area of the city before 1850. That's where they ended up. The Quakers were very good with the other religions and gave them property all over the city to build their churches. So again in 1950. The original Episcopal Church of the original settlers was on the corner of 2nd and State Street. So there's an Episcopal church there now. So when they moved out and built the church on Union Street, they gave the church on the corner of 2nd and State Street to, a AME Zion church. There were 2 churches there actually, both primarily black parishioners. They were both given to them by the Quakers. So there was a Methodist church. It's still there, just below 5th Street on Warren Street, next to Nolides. Across the street, there was a church across the street. I'm trying to remember what it was. It was a Dutch Reformed church. Okay, so it's just below 5th, where the new store was built. That was a Dutch Reformed church. So it burned, in the 1950s, and they rebuilt it on Green Street. There were probably 5 Lutheran churches in Hudson, and 4 or 5 Baptist churches in Hudson. They're all, you still could see the buildings, you'd see the structures. None of them continue. The biggest Lutheran church was on the corner of 6th and Columbia Street. The biggest Baptist church was on the corner of City Hall Place and Union Street. Synagogue was located just above Front Street on the north side of Front Street. Now it's the Shiloh Baptist Church. So when they left there in the 60s and moved to where they are now, they worked out a deal with the Shiloh so the Shiloh could move there. The Shiloh was on Columbia Street, just below 3rd Street, I think, before they moved over there. Got other ones you can think of that I find out where they were?
You've got Greek or Orthodox, Greek Orthodox.
There's both a Russian Orthodox church and a Ukrainian Orthodox church. We're on the west side of 2nd Street on Union Street, and across the street was a Roman Catholic church. And then on 2nd Street, north of State Street, was a Polish Catholic church that was called, I can't remember. Yes?
I don't want to change the subject, but I'm having trouble reconciling why they would locate a major whaling industry here and having to sail 100 miles up the Hudson, which must have been kind of difficult with those big ships.
Well, they were expert seamen, so they certainly knew what they were doing. But primarily they did it because they wanted the protection of the guns at West Point. So they came there in 1783, right after the Peace of Paris was signed. It was their intention to do that while they were waiting for the treaty to be signed. They had scouted the Hudson River and picked the Clarvic Landing as their location just for that reason. They wanted the protection for their sailors on their ships from the British Navy primarily.
Thank you. So they may not have done it had the treaty been earlier. They'd already started the whole process of finding a new place, and then the war ended, and then they came sort of after the fact.
I can't answer that. I don't know the answer to that.
Oh, if they came here after the treaty,
Then
they didn't have to worry about being protected that much.
almost immediately. Well, no, but the British, they didn't trust the British. You kidding me?
Period.
Period. No. And with good cause, because the British impressed them for easily 20 years after they were here.
They're preparing
in
for the next time.
Right. They knew what they were doing. They were just protecting themselves. Yes.
Maybe it's too late to ask this question, but as you're talking about the development of Hudson, I'm wondering about the non-white population and what it looked like and how it contributed to the development of the community. And I don't know if it's easy to say that in a short amount of time or if that lends itself to another
I
discussion.
talked earlier about slavery. Were you here then?
Yes.
Okay. So there wasn't much slavery in Hudson. The Nantucketers didn't bring any slaves with them, and there were very few, I've never even seen a mention of a slave in Hudson. There was a significant, escaped population that lived in Hudson. Easily 100 families, 100 people, maybe even 100 families who were here in the early 19th century and, thrived here. There were 2 churches. They thrived. They did well. They were free people, and they worked, and they carried on, and they had a life.
On that subject, in going to the southern hemisphere for the whaling, did the crewmen come back with, were there diverse?
Did they come back with slaves? No, absolutely
Not with slaves, but just people from.
Oh,
different lands
absolutely.
and-
In the 1780s, they came back with, everybody. Anybody who wanted to work came back on those ships and came back to Hudson. So yes, definitely, there were free black people who were on those ships, definitely. And many others, many others. There were probably 20 nationalities in Hudson by 1800. They all came to work on sailing ships.
I think you said it, but I missed. What was this building? It looks like an armory.
It was an armory. Yeah. So this building was built about 1880, and was used as a National Guard armory until the 1950s. State of New York closed it. It sat idle for 50 years, and the city and the various owners would fight about the taxes on it. Eventually, somebody let it go for taxes. So. Yeah, Galvin Foundation ended up with it. Yes.
The Van Huysens and the Van Rensselaers fought over this land. There was a big lawsuit where
Right.
the Van Rensselaers had the manor.
Right. So the Van Rensselaers, their manor houses were in Clarver. So there's 2 of them, 2 big ones on Route 23 in Clarver, and the Van Huysens were Dutch farmers, a different class and style than the Van Rensselaers. But the Van Huysens owned an awful lot of property and were much more cosmopolitan in their view of the world. So they were way more accepting. They sold the land. They were accepting of the proprietors. What?
Is this a patroon ship here from Frank Rensselaer?
Part of Columbia County was in a patroon ship. Okay, it was in the Van Rensselaer Manor, and the other part, in the southern part, was in the Livingston Manor.
Right. So where was Hudson in that?
Hudson was not in it.
Oh, it wasn't at it.
No.
Okay.
Hudson was not in it. Kinderhook, Stuyvesant, none of those places were in the patroons.
How much was in the patronship?
The eastern part of the county, so from Clarvik to, to
Hillsdale.
Hillsdale. Yeah. I don't think Copac and Ankrum were in it. Yes.
What is a patronship?
So, in the 19th century, or in the 17th century, when the Dutch originally came here, patroonships were patents, land patents that were created by the Dutch West India Company and by the Dutch government to encourage settlement in the Western Hemisphere. And so it was a harken back to feudalism in Europe. It was very, very similar to that. So the patroons had tenants, and their tenants worked to pay their rent. And so, I didn't get any chance to talk about all these things, but, in 1840, the tenants had it, and they started to revolt. And they revolted against the Rensselaers and somewhat against the Livingston, more against the Rensselaers. And, the state of New York sent military, the Hudson, to put down the revolt.
Yeah, over Andes was the rent wars, and I was in New Lebanon, they talked about the rent wars.
Right. The
It was
anti-rent wars
everywhere.
were all over, but they centered in Hudson because the jail, the goal, G-A-O-L, Dutch word, the goal, was in Hudson. And so a lot of the wars took place right there. The hangings took place right there, 4th and Warren. Tenants were hung for asserting their revolutionary rights in downtown Hudson.
How many hangings?
2.
There's a movie about it.
Sorry?
I think Hudson was outside of the internship.
It was, but it was the county seat.
Got it.
So the jail was here and the courthouse was here. So when they would try for, their revolutionary events that occurred, there were assaults, battery, attacks on both sides. And of course, the police were in control. So.
And they were supportive of the Vanderbilt state.
Who?
The military police.
Yeah.
What was the relationship, or what was the turnover from the patroonships to the cooperation with the government?
They changed the law.
Right, they changed the law, and then Rensselaers basically were one of the most powerful groups in New York State until after 1850. And they owned thousands